The distant sound of hoofbeats pounding against the parched earth was the only warning Nora Osborne had before the bandits crested the ridge, their silhouettes menacing against the brilliant orange sunset of the Wyoming territory. It was 1876, and she had been foolish to believe that the stagecoach would make it to Wasco without incident. Now, as the driver's body lay crumpled in the dirt and the other passengers cowered inside, she realized how dangerously naive she had been. Well, what do we have here? The leader of the bandits grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth beneath his unkempt mustache. Looks like we got ourselves some city folk with more money than sense. Nora clutched her reticule tightly against her chest, feeling the weight of the money her father had given her to start her new life. 22 years old and traveling alone to take over her late aunt's millinery shop, she had ignored the warnings about the dangers that lurked on the frontier. The bandits, 4 of them, all with weathered faces and cold eyes, circled the stagecoach like vultures. The 2 remaining passengers, an elderly couple, trembled beside her. "Step out nice and easy," the leader commanded, his pistol trained on the door, "and don't try anything stupid." Nora's legs shook as she descended from the coach, the dust from the road clinging to her navy traveling dress. She kept her chin high, determined not to show fear despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Hand over your valuables," another bandit demanded, dismounting and approaching with a burlap sack. "Jewelry, money, everything." The elderly man tried to protest, only to receive a brutal strike to the face with the butt of a pistol. His wife screamed as he crumpled to the ground. "Please," Nora began, "we're just simple travelers." "Shut your mouth, girl," the leader snapped, turning his attention to her. His eyes raked over her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. "You'll be worth more than whatever's in that little bag of yours." As he reached for her arm, a single gunshot cracked through the air. The leader jerked backward, clutching his shoulder as blood blossomed through his shirt. The bandits whirled around, guns drawn, searching for the source of the shot. A second shot rang out and another bandit fell from his horse. The remaining men fired wildly toward a rock formation about 50 yards away, but they were shooting blind. "It's an ambush," one shouted, panic evident in his voice. "There's just one shooter," the leader growled through gritted teeth. "Fan out and kill the bastard." As the bandits split up, a lone figure emerged from behind the rocks. Even at a distance, Nora could tell he moved with purpose and precision. His hat pulled low over his eyes, a bandana covering the lower half of his face, he advanced steadily, firing with deadly accuracy. Within moments, 2 more bandits lay motionless on the ground. The leader, realizing he was outmatched, turned his horse and fled, leaving a trail of dust and blood behind him. The stranger approached the stagecoach, holstering his pistol. As he drew closer, Nora saw that he was tall and broad-shouldered, with intense blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He removed the bandana from his face, revealing a strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble. "Thank you," Nora said, her voice trembling with relief and lingering fear. "You saved our lives." The man nodded but didn't speak. He dismounted and checked on the elderly couple, helping the man to his feet with a gentle steadiness that seemed at odds with the violence he had just unleashed. "Are you heading to Wasco?" Nora asked. "We've lost our driver." The stranger nodded again, then made a series of gestures with his hands. "I don't understand," Nora said, frowning slightly. The elderly woman spoke up, her voice weak but clear. "He's using sign language, dear. My late brother was deaf, I recognize it, though I never learned much myself." The stranger took a small notebook from his pocket and scribbled something, then handed it to Nora. "My name is Daniel Evans. I'll get you safely to Wasco," she read aloud. She looked up at him, taking in his weathered duster, worn boots, and the well-maintained Winchester rifle on his saddle. Every inch the frontier cowboy, but with an air of quiet dignity. "You're mute?" she asked, immediately regretting the bluntness of her question. He nodded, no offense visible in his expression. "Thank you, Mr. Evans," she said. I'm Nora Osborne, and these are Mr. and Mrs. Bailey." Daniel gestured toward the bodies of the bandits and then to the stagecoach. "I think he wants to know if we can continue our journey," Mr. Bailey interpreted hesitantly. Daniel nodded in confirmation. "The wheel looks damaged," Nora observed, "and we have no driver." Daniel wrote in his notebook again, "I can drive. Wasco is 10 miles. We'll reach by nightfall." After burying the driver with as much dignity as circumstances allowed, Daniel took the reins of the stagecoach. Nora sat beside him on the driver's bench, partly out of curiosity about their silent savior, and partly because the elderly couple needed space to tend to Mr. Bailey's injuries. As the stagecoach lumbered toward Wasco, Nora found herself studying Daniel's profile. His face told a story of hardship and resilience. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, and his hands, strong and calloused, handled the reins with practiced ease. "Have you always been unable to speak?" she asked, immediately regretting her forwardness. "I'm sorry, that was terribly rude of me." Daniel gave her a sidelong glance, his expression unreadable. He shook his head, then gestured to his throat and made a slashing motion. "An injury?" she guessed. He nodded, his eyes returning to the trail ahead. Nora wanted to ask more but sensed his reluctance. Instead, she told him about herself, her journey from Boston after her aunt's passing, her plans to take over the millinery shop, her hope for a new beginning in the West. "My father thought I was mad to come alone," she admitted. Perhaps he was right, considering what happened today. Daniel wrote in his notebook without taking his eyes off the trail for too long, "The West is dangerous but good, worth the risk." "Is that why you're here?" she asked. "For a new beginning," he shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear younger than she'd initially thought. Not much older than 30, she guessed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the scrubland, the lights of Wasco appeared in the distance. A small but growing settlement in the Wyoming territory, it represented hope and opportunity for many, including Nora. "We've made it," she said, relief evident in her voice. Daniel nodded, guiding the horses toward the main street. The stagecoach drew curious glances as it rolled into town. It wasn't the scheduled arrival time, and the presence of a strange man at the reins rather than the regular driver didn't go unnoticed. They stopped outside the Wasco Hotel, a 2-story wooden structure that was one of the more imposing buildings in town. Daniel helped the Baileys down from the coach, supporting Mr. Bailey, who was still unsteady on his feet. A small crowd had gathered, including the town sheriff, a stocky man with a salt and pepper mustache. "What happened to Jim?" the sheriff asked, referring to the regular driver. Nora explained about the bandits and Daniel's timely intervention. The sheriff's expression grew grim. "The Blackwell gang," he said. "They've been terrorizing stagecoaches for months now. You folks are lucky to be alive." He turned to Daniel. "You took on the Blackwell gang alone." Daniel shrugged modestly. "He shot 3 of them," Nora said. "The leader escaped wounded." The sheriff studied Daniel with newfound respect. "You got a name, stranger?" Daniel reached for his notebook, but Nora spoke up. "His name is Daniel Evans. He's mute." "Well, Mr. Evans, you've done this town a service," the sheriff said. "Those bandits have been a thorn in our side for too long." As the Baileys were helped into the hotel, Nora turned to Daniel. "Where will you stay tonight?" He gestured toward the livery stable at the end of the street. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "You saved our lives. The least I can do is ensure you have a proper bed for the night." Despite his protests conveyed through gestures and written notes, Nora insisted on paying for a room for him at the hotel. It was a significant expense given her limited funds, but she couldn't bear the thought of her rescuer sleeping in a stable while she enjoyed comfort. "Consider it a token of my gratitude," she said as they stood in the hotel lobby. "And perhaps tomorrow you could show me to my aunt's shop." "It's called Finch Millinery on Main Street," Daniel wrote. "I know it. We'll take you in morning." "Thank you," she said, extending her hand. For everything. He took her hand in his, and she was struck by the gentleness of his touch despite his obvious strength. As he released her hand and turned to follow the hotel clerk to his room, Nora found herself watching him go, curiosity and something she couldn't quite name stirring within her. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the trauma of the previous day's events somewhat dulled by a night's rest in a proper bed. Nora dressed in one of her simpler dresses, a pale blue cotton with minimal embellishments, suitable for the frontier town that would now be her home. In the hotel dining room, she found Daniel already seated, a cup of coffee before him. He stood as she approached, tipping his hat in greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Evans," she said, taking the seat he offered. "I trust you slept well," he nodded, then gestured to her in question. "Yes, I slept better than I expected, considering the circumstances," she replied. After a simple breakfast of eggs and bacon, they set out for Finch Millinery. Main Street was already bustling with activity, horses and wagons passing by, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, miners and cowboys going about their business. Nora felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement as Daniel led her to a modest storefront with a faded sign bearing her aunt's name. Through the dusty window, she could see hat stands and bolts of fabric gathering dust. "It looks like it's been closed for some time," she said, a touch of disappointment in her voice. Daniel pulled out his notebook. "Your aunt was respected, people miss the shop." This small encouragement bolstered her spirits as she unlocked the door with the key that had been sent to her along with her aunt's will. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as they entered, disturbing a layer of dust that danced in the sunbeams streaming through the windows. The interior was just as she remembered from her childhood visits, a counter along one wall, shelves of ribbons and trimmings, a workspace in the back for creating the hats. It smelled of fabric and leather, and faintly of the lavender sachets her aunt had always kept in the drawers. "It needs a good cleaning," she said, running a finger along a dusty shelf, "but it's exactly as I remembered." Daniel gestured toward the rear of the shop, where a door led to what Nora knew was a small apartment, her new home. As they explored the living quarters, a modest sitting room, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom with a narrow bed, Nora felt a growing sense of the magnitude of what she had undertaken. She was truly alone now, in a frontier town thousands of miles from everything familiar. Daniel must have sensed her anxiety, for he wrote, "Wasco is good place, people help each other." "I hope so," she replied. "I've never run a business before. I assisted my aunt during summer visits, but that hardly qualifies me to manage a millinery shop." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. He wrote, "You need someone to help with heavy work, clean, fix, carry." "Are you offering your services, Mr. Evans?" she asked, surprised. He nodded, then added, "Need work, good with hands." Nora considered the offer. She did need help, especially with the initial cleaning and repairs. And there was something about Daniel that made her feel safe, a quiet strength that was reassuring rather than intimidating. "I can't pay much," she warned. He wrote, "Fair wage for fair work." "Then I accept," she said, extending her hand once more. "Partners of a sort." As they shook hands, Nora couldn't help but wonder about the silent cowboy who had come to her rescue. Who was he? What had happened to rob him of his voice? And why did she feel such an immediate connection to him? Over the next few days, they fell into a comfortable routine. Daniel would arrive early each morning, and together they would work on restoring the shop to its former glory. He proved to be as good with his hands as he had claimed, fixing loose floorboards, repairing shelves, and carrying the heavier items that Nora couldn't manage. For her part, Nora cleaned and organized, taking inventory of her aunt's supplies and familiarizing herself with the account books. She found, to her relief, that her aunt had left the business in good financial standing, with a list of regular customers and suppliers. As they worked side by side, Nora found herself increasingly frustrated by the communication barrier. Daniel's notebook was practical but limited, and she longed to have a real conversation with him. On the fourth day, as they took a break for lunch, she brought up the subject. Mr. Evans Daniel, would you be willing to teach me some sign language? It seems more efficient than writing everything down. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by what looked like cautious hope. He nodded, setting aside his sandwich to demonstrate the sign for yes, a fist bobbing up and down. Yes, Nora repeated, mimicking the gesture. And no, she inquired. He showed her a thumb, index, and middle finger pinched together and moved side to side. No, she copied, smiling at the simplicity of it. What about thank you? He demonstrated by touching his lips with the fingertips of his flat hand and moving the hand forward and down toward Nora, like blowing a kiss but more formal. Thank you, she said, performing the sign. This is much better already. Over lunch, he taught her the alphabet, patiently correcting her when she made mistakes. By the end of the meal, she could fingerspell her name and his, albeit slowly. I'll practice, she promised. This is important. Daniel's expression softened and he wrote, Few bother to learn, easier to ignore the mute man. The simple statement squeezed Nora's heart. How lonely must it be to be surrounded by people yet unable to communicate with most of them? Well, I'm not most people, she declared. And I need to be able to speak with my business partner properly. His smile, rare and transformative, was reward enough for her determination. As the days passed, Nora's sign language vocabulary grew steadily. She learned common words: first work, shop, hat, customer, money, and gradually added verbs, adjectives, and more complex concepts. Daniel was a patient teacher, and she was a dedicated student. The shop was nearly ready to reopen, and Nora had placed orders for new materials to supplement what remained of her aunt's inventory. Word had spread through town that Finch Millinery would soon be back in business, now run by the original owner's niece from Boston. Curious townspeople would occasionally stop by, peering through the windows or even venturing inside to introduce themselves. Nora met the mayor's wife, the schoolteacher, the banker and his daughter, and various other Wasco residents. Most were welcoming, though some regarded her with the suspicion often reserved for newcomers in small communities. Daniel was usually present during these visits, working quietly in the background. Nora noticed how some visitors eyed him with curiosity or discomfort, clearly aware of his inability to speak but uncertain how to interact with him. One afternoon, the sheriff stopped by, removing his hat as he entered the shop. "Miss Osborne," he greeted her. "Place is looking mighty fine." "Your aunt would be proud." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied. "I couldn't have done it without Mr. Evans' help." The sheriff nodded to Daniel, who returned the gesture respectfully. "I've been asking around about those bandits," the sheriff said. "The leader, the one who got away, was Jake Blackwell himself. He's been spotted across the state line, nursing a shoulder wound." Daniel's expression hardened at the news. "Thought you should know," the sheriff continued. "He's been known to hold grudges. Might be best to keep your guard up, both of you." After the sheriff left, Nora turned to Daniel, concern evident in her expression. "Do you think he'll come back? For revenge," Daniel considered before signing. "Possible, but not soon. He is wounded, hunted." Nora had become proficient enough in sign language to understand most of what Daniel communicated, though complex ideas still required his notebook at times. "I won't let fear dictate my life," she declared, straightening a display of ribbons with perhaps more force than necessary. "This shop opens in 3 days, bandits or no bandits." Daniel's eyes crinkled with amusement as he signed, "Brave woman." "Not brave," she countered. "Simply stubborn, as my father would say." As the grand reopening approached, Nora found herself increasingly curious about Daniel's past. He had become a constant in her new life, reliable, supportive, and, she had to admit, increasingly important to her. Yet she knew almost nothing about him beyond his name and the fact that an injury had taken his voice. The evening before the reopening, as they finished the final preparations, she gathered her courage to ask. "Daniel," she began, waiting until he looked up from the display he was arranging. "Would you tell me about yourself? Where you're from, what brought you to Wasco, how you—" She hesitated, then signed rather than spoke. "Lost your voice." He was still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for his notebook, clearly feeling that this conversation required more nuance than sign language would allow. Born in Missouri, he wrote. Family had small farm. War came, I fought for Union at 18. After war, family gone, farm gone, drifted west. Nora read over his shoulder. I'm sorry about your family. Was it the war? He nodded, then continued writing. Smallpox, while I was fighting, couldn't save them. And your voice. She asked gently, his jaw tightened, but he wrote. Shrapnel from cannon, 1864, Battle of Nashville. Damaged vocal cords, doctors said never speak again. Nora felt tears prick at her eyes, imagining the young soldier, barely a man, losing his voice and then returning home to find his family gone. You've endured so much, he shrugged, as if to dismiss the weight of his experiences, then wrote, Everyone has burdens, learn to live with them or be crushed. Is that why you came west? For a fresh start? Partly, he wrote. Also good place for man who can't speak. Out here, actions matter more than words. As she read his words, Nora was struck by the profound truth in them. In the short time she had known Daniel, she had come to trust him implicitly, not because of what he said, but because of what he did, his courage, his reliability, his quiet integrity. Thank you for sharing this with me, she said, both speaking and signing the words. It can't be easy to revisit such painful memories. He regarded her thoughtfully, then wrote one more line. Easier to share with someone who listens even to silence. The reopening of Finch Millinery was a modest success. Several of the town's ladies came to browse, and a few placed orders for new hats or the refurbishment of old ones. Nora, wearing one of her own creations, a stylish bonnet trimmed with silk flowers, greeted customers and showcased her work with growing confidence. Daniel stayed in the background, manning the counter when Nora was busy with customers and keeping the shop in order. His presence seemed to intrigue the townswomen, some of whom clearly found the silent, handsome cowboy an added attraction to the millinery. Your assistant is quite striking, Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, commented in a hushed tone. Such a shame about his condition. Was he born that way? No, Mrs. Peterson, Nora replied coolly, adjusting the lady's hat. Mr. Evans was wounded fighting for the Union. His sacrifice deserves our respect, not our pity. The woman had the grace to look abashed. Of course, my dear, I meant no disrespect. By the end of the day, Nora had taken several orders and sold 2 ready-made hats. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a promising start. As the last customer left, she turned to Daniel with a beaming smile. We did it. She exclaimed, signing along with her words as had become her habit when they were alone. He returned her smile and signed, You did it. This is your achievement. I couldn't have done it without you, she insisted. We make a good team. His expression softened, and for a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a connection that went beyond their working relationship. Nora felt her heart quicken, and she turned away, suddenly flustered. We should celebrate, she said, moving to lock the door. I have a bottle of wine my aunt kept for special occasions. Would you join me for supper? Daniel hesitated, then signed. People will talk. Nora hadn't considered how it might appear an unmarried woman entertaining a man in her private quarters. In Boston, it would have been scandalous. But this was the frontier, where conventional rules sometimes bent out of necessity. Let them talk, she said with more bravado than she felt. We're business partners celebrating a successful opening day. Besides, my reputation is hardly the most interesting topic in Wasco. After another moment's hesitation, Daniel nodded in agreement. Nora prepared a simple meal in her small kitchen stew she had made the night before, fresh bread from the bakery down the street, and the promised bottle of wine. They ate at the tiny table in her sitting room, the space so compact that their knees occasionally brushed beneath the table. As they shared the meal, Nora realized how comfortable she had become in Daniel's presence. The silence that might have been awkward with anyone else felt natural with him. They communicated through signs, expressions, and occasional notes, But there was also an unspoken understanding that required no translation. After they had eaten, Daniel helped clear the dishes, moving with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. As he handed her the last plate, their fingers brushed, and Nora felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with static electricity. She looked up to find him watching her, his blue eyes intense in the lamplight. For a breathless moment, she thought he might step closer, might bridge the gap between them. Instead, he stepped back and signed, "Late. Should go." Disappointment washed through her, though she wasn't sure what she had been expecting or hoping for. "Of course," she said, composing herself. "Thank you for your help today and for sharing the meal." He nodded, retrieving his hat from the hook by the door. Before leaving, he signed, "Proud of you," his expression conveying what words signed or spoken could not fully express. After he left, Nora sat alone in her small sitting room, the memory of his presence still lingering. She had come to Wasco seeking a new beginning, a life of her own making. She had not expected to find someone like Daniel, a man whose silence spoke volumes, whose steadiness anchored her in this new and sometimes frightening world. "This is foolishness," she told herself firmly. "He works for you, he's been kind because you pay him to be." But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. The way he looked at her, the way he had shared his painful past, the gentle care he took with everything he did for her, these weren't the actions of a man merely fulfilling a contract. She went to bed that night with her thoughts in turmoil, uncertain what the future held but increasingly certain that she wanted Daniel Evans to be part of it. The next few weeks saw Finch Millinery establish itself as a fixture in Wasco once more. Word spread about the quality of Nora's work, and customers came not only from town but from surrounding homesteads and even neighboring settlements. Daniel continued to work alongside her, his role evolving from handyman to full partner in all but name. He had a good eye for color and design, occasionally suggesting combinations that Nora might not have considered. When customers came in, he would step back, but Nora made a point of introducing him properly and explaining that they could communicate through sign language. Some customers were initially uncomfortable, but most adapted quickly, especially when they saw how efficiently the pair worked together. A few even began to learn basic signs themselves, greeting Daniel with a signed hello when they entered the shop. As spring turned to summer, Nora found herself increasingly aware of Daniel as more than a business partner. She noticed the way sunlight caught in his dark blonde hair, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the graceful strength of his hands as he signed. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart race, only for him to look away when she met his gaze. One evening, as they closed the shop after a particularly busy day, Nora broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Daniel," she began, "you've taught me so much sign language, but I'm curious about something. Are there signs for feelings? For emotions beyond just happy or sad?" He studied her for a moment, then signed, "What feelings?" Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Well, for instance, how would you sign 'I care for you'? Or 'I admire you'?" His expression grew serious as he demonstrated, his movements deliberate. "I care for you is like this," he signed, pointing to himself, then crossing his arms over his chest and finally pointing to her. "And I admire you." She asked, her voice softer. He showed her a different sign, pointing to himself, then making a gesture from his forehead outward toward her. "Are there stronger feelings that can be expressed?" she asked, hardly believing her own boldness. Daniel's eyes never left hers as he signed slowly, deliberately, "I cherish you." The sign involved holding his hand to his heart and then extending it toward her. "And love," Nora whispered, her heart pounding. He hesitated only briefly, before showing her, pointing to himself, crossing his arms over his heart, and pointing to her with an intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken emotions. Nora took a step closer to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely audible, "I've been practicing a phrase I wanted to get right." With trembling hands, she signed, "I love you." For a moment, he stood perfectly still, disbelief and hope warring in his expression. Then, with a movement that seemed both inevitable and surprising, he closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cradle her face with exquisite gentleness. His lips met hers in a kiss that conveyed everything words could not: tenderness, passion, longing, and yes, love. Nora melted into him, her hands finding purchase on his solid chest, the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm more eloquent than any spoken declaration. When they finally parted, both breathless, Daniel's eyes searched hers as if seeking confirmation that what had happened was real, that she truly meant what she had signed. In response, Nora signed, "I love you" again, more confidently this time. A smile of pure joy transformed his face as he returned the sign, then pulled her close once more. Their courtship progressed with the same quiet intensity that characterized everything about Daniel. In public, they maintained a professional demeanor, though attentive observers might have noticed the lingering glances, the way their hands would brush as they worked side by side, the private language of signs they shared. In private, they explored their deepening feelings, learning each other's stories, dreams, and fears. Daniel told her, through signs and written words, about his life since the war, the years of drifting, taking work where he could find it, learning to navigate a world where his silence marked him as different, as less. Nora shared her own struggles, the expectations placed on her as the daughter of a successful Boston merchant, her rebellion against the marriage her parents had tried to arrange for her, her determination to forge her own path, even if it led to the edge of the civilized world. "My father wanted me to marry the son of his business partner," she told Daniel one evening as they sat on the small porch behind her shop. "Harold Wellington, 20 years my senior, with the personality of a damp handkerchief." Daniel's shoulders shook with silent laughter as he signed, "Poor Harold." "Poor me," Nora protested, though she was smiling. "When Aunt Judith left me the shop, it was the perfect escape. Father was furious, of course, but even he couldn't deny my legal right to the inheritance." Daniel signed thoughtfully, "Brave to leave everything familiar, or foolish," she replied. "I had no idea what I was getting into if those bandits had succeeded." She shuddered at the memory. Daniel took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. He signed with his free hand, somewhat awkwardly but clearly. "Fate brought us together." "Do you believe in fate?" she asked, curious. He considered this, then nodded, releasing her hand to sign more fully. How else explain Union soldier from Missouri meets Boston lady in Wyoming? Many chances to miss each other, yet here we are. "Here we are," she echoed softly, leaning into his solid warmth as the summer twilight deepened around them. As their relationship deepened, so did the complexity of the conversations they could have through sign language. Nora became increasingly fluent, to the point where they could discuss almost anything without resorting to writing. The town of Wasco gradually accepted their relationship, though not without some initial gossip. An unmarried shopkeeper and her mute assistant were bound to raise eyebrows, but as time passed, the novelty wore off. It helped that Daniel had earned respect for his confrontation with the Blackwell gang, and that Nora had revived a beloved local business. The sheriff made a point of stopping by the shop regularly, partly out of friendship and partly, Nora suspected, to keep an eye out for any sign of Jake Blackwell's return. There had been no sightings of the bandit leader since he'd fled across the state line, but the sheriff remained vigilant. "Better safe than sorry," he told Nora one afternoon as Daniel worked in the back room. "Blackwell's the type to nurse a grudge. It's been months," Nora pointed out. "Surely he's moved on to other targets by now," the sheriff shrugged. "Maybe. But men like that don't forget being shown up, especially not by someone they'd consider different." He nodded toward the back room where Daniel was working. His words left Nora uneasy, but she refused to let fear overshadow the life she was building. The shop was thriving, her relationship with Daniel was deepening by the day, and Wasco was beginning to feel like home. In late summer, the town held its annual Founders' Day celebration, a weekend of festivities including a dance, contests of skill, and a community picnic. Nora closed the shop for the occasion and worked on a new dress for the dance, a sky blue creation that she hoped would complement her eyes. "Will you escort me to the dance?" she asked Daniel one evening, signing as she spoke. He hesitated, his expression troubled. "People will stare," he signed. "The mute man cannot dance." "I don't care if people stare," she replied firmly. "And who says you can't dance? You don't need to speak to follow a waltz." He smiled at her determination but still seemed uncertain. "Never learned to dance," he admitted. "War came then." He gestured to his throat. "Then I'll teach you," Nora declared. "It's simple, really. Just follow the rhythm and the steps." In the privacy of her sitting room, with the furniture pushed aside to create a makeshift dance floor, Nora taught Daniel to waltz. She hummed the melody as she guided him through the basic box step. He was a quick learner, his natural grace and physical awareness making up for his lack of experience. After some initial awkwardness, they found their rhythm, moving together as if they'd been dancing for years. As they practiced, the formality of the dance gave way to something more intimate, Daniel pulling her closer than propriety strictly allowed, Nora's head coming to rest against his chest where she could feel rather than hear the steady beat of his heart. When they finally stopped, they remained in each other's arms, reluctant to break the spell. "See," Nora said, looking up at him with a smile, "you can dance beautifully." In response, he lowered his head and kissed her a kiss that began tenderly but quickly deepened, conveying the desire that had been building between them for months. When they finally parted, both breathless, Daniel signed with hands that weren't entirely steady. "I want to court you properly. Not just as your employee, as a man who loves you." Nora's heart swelled at the formal declaration. "Yes," she signed and spoke simultaneously. "I want that too." The night of the dance arrived, and Nora waited nervously in her sitting room, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her new dress. When a knock came at the door, she took a deep breath before answering. Daniel stood there, transformed from the working cowboy she knew to a gentleman in his Sunday best. He had trimmed his beard, and his usually wind-tousled hair was neatly combed. In his hand, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. His eyes widened appreciatively as he took in her appearance, and he signed one-handed, "Beautiful," before offering her the flowers. "Thank you," she replied, taking the bouquet and inhaling their sweet fragrance. "You look quite handsome yourself." They walked arm in arm to the town hall where the dance was being held. Nora could feel the curious glances of townspeople as they entered, but she held her head high, proud to be on Daniel's arm. The hall had been transformed with bunting and lanterns, a small orchestra set up on a platform at one end. Couples already swirled around the dance floor, while others chatted in small groups along the edges of the room. Daniel hesitated at the entrance, and Nora felt his arm tense beneath her hand. "We don't have to dance right away," she assured him. "Let's get some punch first." As they made their way to the refreshment table, several people greeted them, some with genuine warmth, others with poorly concealed curiosity. Nora introduced Daniel to those he hadn't yet met, patiently explaining about sign language when necessary. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife who had once commented on Daniel's condition, approached them with a smile that seemed sincere enough. "Miss Osborne, you look lovely tonight," she said. "And Mr. Evans, how nice to see you at a social event. Will you be dancing this evening?" Before Daniel could respond, Nora spoke up. "Indeed he will, Mrs. Peterson. Mr. Evans is an excellent dancer." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but she recovered quickly. "How wonderful. I look forward to seeing you both on the dance floor." As she walked away, Daniel gave Nora a look that was half amusement, half exasperation. "What?" Nora asked innocently. "You are an excellent dancer. We proved that already." He shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips as he signed, "Only with you." When a waltz began, Nora set down her punch cup and looked at Daniel expectantly. After a moment's hesitation, he offered his arm, leading her onto the dance floor. They began somewhat stiffly, Daniel clearly conscious of the eyes upon them. But as they continued to move around the floor, his confidence grew. By the middle of the dance, they were moving as smoothly as any couple there, perhaps more so, given the intensity of their focus on each other. When the music ended, there was a smattering of applause, and Nora noticed several approving nods from the onlookers. Daniel's cheeks were flushed, but he was smiling as he led her back to the edge of the dance floor. The evening continued pleasantly, with more dances interspersed with conversation with the townspeople. Nora was pleased to see how many people made an effort to include Daniel, some even attempting the basic signs she had taught them over the past months. As they were enjoying a brief respite from dancing, the sheriff approached them, his expression serious despite the festive atmosphere. "Miss Osborne, Mr. Evans," he greeted them. "Hate to interrupt your evening, but I thought you should know. There's been a sighting of Jake Blackwell about 20 miles from here. He was asking questions about Wasco." Nora felt a chill despite the warmth of the crowded hall. "You think he's coming here, after all this time?" "Can't say for certain," the sheriff replied. "But I'd advise both of you to be extra cautious. Blackwell's not the type to forgive or forget." Daniel's expression hardened, and he signed to Nora, who translated for the sheriff. "He says we'll be careful. Thank you for the warning." After the sheriff moved on, Nora turned to Daniel, concern evident in her eyes. "Do you think he'll really come after us?" Daniel considered, then signed, "Possible. Men like Blackwell have pride, nothing else, but we will be ready." Despite the sheriff's warning, the remainder of the dance passed without incident, and Daniel escorted Nora home as the evening drew to a close. At her door, he hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with the threat of Blackwell looming. "I'll be fine," she assured him, reading his concern. "The door locks securely, and I have the derringer you gave me." Still, he lingered, his eyes scanning the darkened street before returning to her face. "Daniel," she said softly, "you can't stand guard outside my door all night." He smiled ruefully, acknowledging the truth of her words, then signed, "Be vigilant. Keep the gun close." "I promise," she replied, then added with deliberate lightness, "Now, aren't you forgetting something?" His expression softened as he stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek as he bent to kiss her goodnight. It was a gentle kiss, full of tenderness, but with an undercurrent of protectiveness that made Nora feel both cherished and frustrated by her own vulnerability. When they parted, he signed, "I love you," the movements fluid and natural after months of practice. "I love you too," she replied, both signing and speaking the words. As he walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night, Nora couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. She locked her door securely and checked the windows before readying herself for bed, the derringer never far from reach. The next morning, Daniel arrived earlier than usual, relief evident in his expression when he saw Nora safe and well. They opened the shop as normal, but Nora noticed that Daniel positioned himself where he could see the street through the front window. His vigilance a constant reminder of the danger that might be approaching. Days passed without incident, and gradually, the tension began to ease. The Founders' Day celebration had been good for business, with several visitors to town placing orders for hats before returning to their homes in surrounding settlements. Nora was working on one such order, a wide-brimmed hat for a rancher's wife, when the shop door opened, the bell jingling cheerfully. She looked up with a welcoming smile that froze on her face as she recognized the man who entered. Jake Blackwell had changed since their encounter on the stagecoach. The well-groomed bandit leader had been replaced by a haggard man with an unkempt beard and a permanent sneer. But his eyes were the same cold and calculating as they fixed on Nora. "Remember me, miss," he drawled, closing the door behind him. "'Cause I sure remember you. And that mute bastard who shot up my boys." Nora's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. Daniel had gone to the livery to pick up supplies, and she was alone in the shop. "Mr. Blackwell," she acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. "What can I do for you?" He laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "Well, ain't you the proper lady? What you can do is tell me where to find your silent friend. Him and I have unfinished business." "He's not here," Nora replied, edging toward the counter where she kept the derringer. "And the sheriff knows you've been seen in the area. He's looking for you." Blackwell's hand moved to the gun at his hip. "I ain't concerned about some small-town lawman. My business is with the mute who killed my brother and two good men." "Your brother?" Nora repeated, the piece of information catching her by surprise. "Yep, one of the men your friend gunned down was my little brother Tim." His face twisted with grief and rage. "So you see, this ain't just about business anymore, it's personal." Nora had reached the counter, her hand moving slowly toward the drawer where the derringer was kept. "I'm sorry about your brother, Mr. Blackwell, but he chose to attack innocent travelers. Daniel was defending us." "Don't you speak his name," Blackwell snarled, drawing his gun. "Tim was just a kid, got caught up in bad company. He didn't deserve to die face down in the dirt." Nora's fingers closed around the handle of the derringer, but before she could withdraw it, the shop door opened again. Daniel stepped in, arms loaded with packages that he dropped immediately upon seeing Blackwell. "Well, well," Blackwell said, swinging his gun toward Daniel. "The man himself saved me the trouble of hunting you down." Daniel moved slowly, positioning himself between Nora and Blackwell, his hands clearly visible at his sides. "Ain't got nothing to say," Blackwell taunted. "Oh, that's right, you can't say nothing. Must be God's joke, making a man silent before sending him to hell." Daniel's expression remained impassive, but Nora could see the tension in his shoulders, the readiness in his stance. "Please," Nora said, stepping out from behind Daniel despite his attempt to keep her behind him. "This won't bring your brother back, Mr. Blackwell." "No, but it'll sure make me feel better," Blackwell replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. In the split second before he could fire, Daniel pushed Nora aside and lunged forward, closing the distance between himself and Blackwell with surprising speed. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the confined space of the shop, but the bullet went wide as Daniel knocked Blackwell's arm upward. The two men grappled, crashing into a display of hat stands as they fought for control of the weapon. Nora scrambled to her feet, the derringer now in her hand, but she couldn't get a clear shot with the men moving so quickly. "Daniel," she cried out as Blackwell managed to slam Daniel against the wall, momentarily stunning him. Blackwell raised his gun again, but before he could fire, Nora took aim and pulled the trigger of her derringer. The small gun bucked in her hand, and Blackwell stumbled, a look of surprise crossing his face as a red stain blossomed on his shirt. He turned toward Nora, his gun still raised, but Daniel recovered and tackled him from behind. The gun discharged again, the bullet splintering the floorboards as both men went down. They rolled across the floor, locked in a desperate struggle. Nora watched in horror as Blackwell produced a knife from his boot and slashed at Daniel, who barely managed to avoid the blade with her derringer spent. Nora looked frantically for a weapon. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the counter and moved toward the fighting men, waiting for an opportunity to strike. It came when Blackwell briefly gained the upper hand, pinning Daniel beneath him, the knife raised for a killing blow. Nora swung the candlestick with all her strength, connecting with Blackwell's head with a sickening thud. The bandit slumped sideways, the knife clattering to the floor. Daniel pushed him off and rose quickly, kicking the knife away and retrieving Blackwell's fallen gun. "Are you hurt?" Nora asked, dropping the candlestick and rushing to Daniel's side. He shook his head, though she could see a tear in his shirt where the knife had grazed his side. A thin line of blood was visible, but the wound didn't appear deep. The shop door burst open as the sheriff and several townsmen rushed in, drawn by the sound of gunfire. "What in blazes?" the sheriff began, then stopped as he took in the scene. Blackwell unconscious on the floor, Daniel holding the bandit's gun, Nora with the spent derringer still in her hand. "Blackwell came for revenge," Nora explained breathlessly. "He was going to kill Daniel." The sheriff knelt beside the fallen bandit, checking his pulse. "He's alive, but you cracked his skull good, Miss Osborne." There was a note of admiration in his voice. "We'll get the doctor to patch him up, then he's headed for prison." The territories had enough of Jake Blackwell and his gang. As Blackwell was carried away and curious onlookers were dispersed, Nora and Daniel were left alone in the shop, surrounded by the destruction of their brief but violent struggle. "You saved my life," Daniel signed, his movements emphatic despite his obvious exhaustion. "You saved mine first," Nora replied, examining the cut on his side. "This needs to be cleaned and bandaged." As she tended to his wound in the back room of the shop, Nora was struck by how close she had come to losing him. The realization brought with it a clarity that had been building for months. "Daniel," she said as she finished securing the bandage, "I don't want to wait anymore." He looked at her questioningly. "For us," she clarified. "For our future together. Life is too uncertain, too precious to waste a single day." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. He signed, "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." Nora took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm saying that I want to marry you, Daniel Evans, if you'll have me." For a long moment he was perfectly still, his expression one of wonder and disbelief. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, he signed, "You would marry a man who cannot speak, who cannot whisper 'I love you' in your ear." "I would marry a man who speaks to me more eloquently with his hands and his heart than most men do with their voices," she replied firmly. "I would marry you, Daniel, exactly as you are." His smile was like the sunrise, gradual, then brilliant, transforming his entire face. He pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his injury, and kissed her with a passion that needed no translation. When they finally parted, he signed against her back where she could feel the movements. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in Wasco's small church, with most of the town in attendance. The sheriff stood as Daniel's best man, while Mrs. Peterson, who had become an unexpected ally, served as Nora's matron of honor. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with accommodations made for Daniel's inability to speak. Instead of verbal vows, they exchanged promises in sign language, which Nora had insisted on learning herself rather than having someone interpret for her. "I, Nora, take you, Daniel, to be my husband," she signed clearly, her voice steady as she spoke the words simultaneously. "To love and to cherish in sickness and in health until death parts us." Daniel's hands moved with precision and grace as he made the same promise, his eyes never leaving hers, filled with a love so profound it brought tears to Nora's eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel pulled Nora close for a kiss that drew applause and a few good-natured whoops from the assembled guests. The celebration continued at the town hall, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Daniel surprised everyone, including Nora, by leading her confidently through the first dance, the lessons in her sitting room having clearly paid off. As the evening progressed, Nora found herself momentarily alone, watching Daniel across the room where he was engaged in a signed conversation with a young boy who had been born deaf. The sight of her husband, for he was her husband now, patiently teaching the child new signs, filled her heart with a joy she had never imagined possible. Mrs. Peterson appeared at her side, following Nora's gaze with an understanding smile. "He's a good man, your Daniel," she said. "The town is fortunate to have you both." "Thank you," Nora replied, genuinely touched by the woman's approval. "We're fortunate to have found a home here." "And children?" Mrs. Peterson inquired with the directness of a frontier woman. "Will there be little advances running around Wasco soon?" Nora felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she answered honestly, "We hope so. Daniel loves children, and I've always wanted a family of my own." "Your children will be blessed," Mrs. Peterson said. "They'll grow up knowing that love doesn't always need words to be understood." As the celebration wound down and the newlyweds prepared to leave, the sheriff approached them with a folded paper in his hand. "Wedding present from the town council," he said, handing the document to Daniel. "Deed to the plot next to the millinery. Thought you might want to expand the business or build a proper house." Daniel's expression of surprise and gratitude needed no translation as he shook the sheriff's hand firmly. "Thank you," Nora said, equally moved by the gesture. "This means more than you know." Their first home as a married couple was the small apartment behind the shop, but with the gifted land, they began planning for a future that seemed brighter with each passing day. Fall came to Wasco, bringing cooler temperatures and the golden hues of changing leaves. The millinery business continued to thrive, with Nora's reputation spreading throughout the territory. Daniel had taken on more responsibilities in the shop, his eye for design complementing Nora's technical skills. As they settled into married life, they established routines and rituals that bridged the silence between them. Each morning, Daniel would sign "I love you" before leaving for whatever tasks the day required. Each night, Nora would sign it back as they lay in their narrow bed, the quietness of their exchange making it all the more intimate. They began work on their new home, with Daniel overseeing the construction and Nora designing the interior spaces. It would be modest but comfortable, with room to grow as their family expanded. By winter, the framework of the house was complete, and they hosted a small gathering to celebrate. Standing in what would eventually be their parlor, with snow falling gently outside the unfinished windows, Nora had an announcement of her own to make. With Daniel at her side, she addressed their friends the sheriff, Mrs. Peterson and her husband, the Baileys who had been with them during the bandit attack, and others who had become dear to them in Wasco. "Daniel and I have news to share," she said, signing as she spoke, as had become her habit in both public and private. "Come spring, our family will be growing by one small member." There were exclamations of delight and congratulations from all sides. Daniel, who had known the news for only a few days, still looked slightly dazed with happiness as he received handshakes and backslaps from the men present. Later, when they were alone, he knelt before Nora, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. His eyes, when they met hers, held a question. "Yes," she said, understanding without need for signs. "Our child will know sign language from the beginning. They will understand that their father speaks with his hands and his heart, and that his voice, though silent, is filled with wisdom and love." Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he pressed a kiss to the place where their child grew, then rose to take Nora in his arms. In the quietness of their embrace, surrounded by the bones of the home they were building, no words signed or spoken were necessary. Spring brought new life to Wasco, wildflowers blooming on the prairie, calves in the ranchers' fields, and the completion of Daniel and Nora's new home. They moved in just as Nora entered her 7th month, her condition now unmistakable beneath the loosened dresses she wore. The house was everything they had planned, airy and bright, with large windows to capture the Wyoming sunshine and a wide porch for summer evenings. Daniel had built much of the furniture himself, including a cradle that sat ready in the nursery, carved with intricate designs that told the story of their love. As Nora's time grew closer, the women of Wasco rallied around her, bringing advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and the reassurance of experience. Mrs. Peterson, who had raised 5 children of her own, was particularly attentive, visiting almost daily to check on Nora's progress. Daniel's protectiveness increased with each passing week, to the point where Nora finally had to gently remind him that pregnancy was not an illness, and that she was perfectly capable of walking to the shop without an escort. "I am carrying a child not made of porcelain," she signed with exasperated affection after he insisted on carrying her across a small mud puddle on Main Street. He had the grace to look sheepish, signing back, "Sorry." "Worried?" "I know," she replied, softening. "But your child is as stubborn as both its parents. We'll be fine." Their child, a son, arrived on a stormy night in late May after a labor that tested Nora's endurance to its limits. Daniel, defying convention, refused to leave her side, supporting her through each contraction and wiping the sweat from her brow with tender hands. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Nora's arms, the exhaustion of the past hours vanished in a wave of love so intense it took her breath away. "Look what we did," she whispered to Daniel, who was staring at their son with an expression of awe and disbelief. He reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand, which immediately curled around it with surprising strength. The look that passed over Daniel's face, wonder mixed with fierce protectiveness, made Nora fall in love with him all over again. "What will we call him?" she asked, signing awkwardly with the baby in her arms. Daniel considered for a moment, then signed a name. David Evans." Nora tried it out, smiling at the child who had already begun to doze against her breast. "It's perfect." As David grew from infant to toddler, it became clear that he had inherited his father's quiet intensity and his mother's determined spirit. By his first birthday, he was not only walking but signing simple words: milk, more, mama, papa, before he could speak them aloud. The sight of Daniel and David communicating through sign language, their hands forming the same shapes, their expressions mirroring each other, never failed to fill Nora's heart with joy. David's first spoken word, when it came, was "Papa," a sound that brought tears to Daniel's eyes as he swept his son into a fierce embrace. Life in Wasco continued to evolve. The town grew as the railroad came through, bringing new settlers, new businesses, and new opportunities. Finch Millinery expanded to include ready-to-wear clothing, with Daniel managing that side of the business while Nora continued to create her renowned hats. They had their challenges: a harsh winter that nearly depleted their savings, a fire on Main Street that threatened the shop before being contained, David's bout with scarlet fever that kept them sleepless for a week. But through it all, their love remained constant, a silent language that bound them together through every trial. 3 years after David's birth, Nora gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Michael and Margaret. The house that had seemed so spacious suddenly felt full to bursting with the energy of 3 young children. Daniel took to fatherhood as naturally as he had taken to sign language, his patience seemingly endless as he taught his children not only to sign but to ride, to build, to observe the world around them with open hearts and minds. Nora watched him with their children and marveled at how a man who could not speak aloud could teach so eloquently through example and the language of his hands. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Nora turned to Daniel with a question that had been on her mind. "Do you ever regret it?" she signed. "Not being able to speak?" He considered the question with the thoughtfulness that characterized him, then signed, "Once, yes. After the war, I thought my life was over. No voice meant no future." "And now?" she pressed. He smiled, his gaze moving from her face to their children and back again. "Now I understand that silence taught me to listen, to see what others miss. It brought me to you." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes as he continued, "Without silence, I might never have learned to speak with my hands. Might never have known what it is to be truly heard by someone who listens with her heart." "I love you," she signed, the movement as natural to her now as breathing. "Every day I love you more, and I love you," he replied, reaching for her hand. "My voice." As the sun set over Wasco, casting long shadows across their yard where their children played, Nora leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, secure in the knowledge that some of life's most profound truths need no sound to be understood. In the silence between heartbeats, in the space between words, they had found a language entirely their own, one built on courage, resilience, and a love that spoke volumes without saying a word.